We're in 1 Kings chapter 3, looking at verses 5 through 15. The first question, what was God's offer to Solomon? This is in verse 5, the end of it. God says to Solomon, ask what I shall give you. Basically, it's a blank check, Solomon. Whatever you want, I will give it to you. What do you want, Solomon? What was Solomon's request and why? This is in verse 9. Solomon says, give therefore your servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? He asks for an understanding heart. He asks for wisdom. But it's not just an understanding heart just so he could be wise, just so he could have understanding. But explicitly he states he's asking for this to judge God's people. He wants to be able to have the wisdom to know how to judge between right and wrong, to be able to be a good, a faithful judge over the people that God had called him to reign. The next question, what was God's reaction to this request? Verse 10 says, the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. What other requests did God say Solomon could have made but didn't? This is in verse 11. God says, you didn't ask for yourself for long life. You didn't ask for riches, nor did you ask for the life of your enemies. But you ask for yourself understanding. He didn't ask for long life, not for riches, nor the life of his enemies. These are things that he did not ask for. And the next question, what was wrong with those things? Of themselves, those things are not wrong. This is why we live. We hope to live long. We hope to have some reasonable amount of wealth. We hope to not have enemies conquering us. And that doesn't have to be mortal enemies. It could be enemies in the workplace or enemies otherwise. But these things of themselves are not wrong. But God is pleased that Solomon put something else above these things. And this is what we want to draw from this passage here, is that Solomon did not look to the things that we normally, why am I going to go to work on Monday? Why are you going to go to work early? Why are you going to be diligent on your job? Why are you working hard? Because you want to be able to have riches. You want to have wealth. Why do we take care of our bodies? Why do we want to go to the doctor? Why is it that it's a bad report when we hear about something, a health challenge from a report from our doctor? We all want to live long. We all want to have some reasonable amount of wealth, and we all want to have freedom from those who want to do us wrong. These are the things that we seek. But what is it that pleased God? What is it that Solomon was seeking above these things that made God happy? And then God even says, I'm going to give you these things that you didn't ask for as well. The next question is the key here. What does Solomon's request suggest was his highest priority? Higher than his priority for life, he wanted his own life. Higher than his priority for riches, he wanted riches. Higher than his priority to have victory over his enemies, he wanted victory over his enemies. What priority was higher? Well, Solomon says he wanted an understanding heart to be able to judge your people, to judge thy people, God. He wants to be able to judge this so great thy people. I want to point out verse 7. And now, O Lord, Solomon says, you have made your servant king instead of David, my father. Just think back a little bit here. Just chapter 1 and chapter 2, we have the story of how Solomon became king. Towards the end of David's life, his other son, Adonijah, says that I'm going to be king. And he sets himself up to be king. He works with some of David's own officials, and they set him up to be king over the people. Now, it was known that David had said Solomon would be king. So, of course, if Adonijah is to be a successful king, then Solomon must be killed. But we don't see here that Solomon himself gathers people in response to Adonijah's attempt to take over the kingdom. He doesn't gather people and say, let me lift up arms to go and fight against my brother so that I won't be killed. Nor does he lift up arms to say, I want to fight against my brother that I might have the kingdom that's been promised to me. Nor do we even see Solomon going to David to seek help to stop this attempt to take the kingdom. What we do see is that Nathan the prophet, a man of God, comes to David and comes to Bathsheba and says, hey, Bathsheba, we need to work with David to make sure that Solomon reigns. And Bathsheba says, David, I need you to help so that my son isn't killed, because myself and my son will be counted offenders if this is not stopped. But we don't see Solomon pushing to make himself king. The kingdom has been promised to him, but like his father David, who would not step outside of God's way to make himself king. He wouldn't kill the Lord's anointed, King Saul. David would not do that, because that would be himself making him the king. Solomon, like his father, would not go outside of the way of God to make himself the king. Solomon said, I'm going to trust God. And if it's God's will for me to be king, I'm going to wait on the hand of God to bring that to pass. And so Solomon says here very truthfully, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David, my father. This was not a calling that Solomon made for himself. Solomon did not say, I need to be king. Solomon did not say, look, I have all the abilities and I have the skills and maybe this is something I should do to serve God by becoming king. No, Solomon waited and allowed God to set him up as king. And now that God had put him in this position, now that he knew beyond the shadow of any doubt that it was God's will for him to be king, now this is his highest priority. To do well at what God has entrusted him, to be faithful in the calling that God has given him. Solomon's highest priority was to discharge the trust God had committed to him faithfully. And this comes to ourselves. What is our highest priority? Should our highest priority be a long life? Should it be riches? Should it be security from those that hate us? No, like Solomon, we too, like Jesus, ought to seek not our will, but God's will for our life. Even if that will comes at hardship, comes at sacrifice, comes at difficulty, comes at our own life. We, like Solomon, we, like Jesus, need to be able to say, not my will, but your will be done, Lord. And what is it that I need to be able to accomplish the will of God in my life? To each of us, God has entrusted to us big and small callings, big and small tasks, the overall calling of your life. Yes, maybe God has made you a leader in business. Maybe God has made you a leader in your community. Maybe God has made you a leader in your religious community. Maybe God has called us to these grand and great things, and that's wonderful. And so like Solomon, we ought to be faithful and seek from God what we need to be faithful in those tasks. But also God has called us to smaller things. God has called me to be a husband. I didn't force myself into this. I didn't put this on myself to make myself a husband. I believe that God called me to this task. And if God has called this to me, like Solomon, like Jesus, I must be faithful to this task. I remember watching the Christian movie Courageous. It was a wonderful depiction of the importance of fatherhood. And in there's a line where they say, I don't want to just be an okay dad. It's not enough to just be okay. I've also been called to be a father. God has made me a father. Am I going to be content with mediocrity? Am I going to be content to just be an okay dad or an okay husband or an okay son or an okay brother or an okay coworker or an okay neighbor? Am I going to be content with mediocrity? No, God has called me to be a neighbor. God has called me to be a coworker. God has called me to all of these areas of my life. And it is up to me to, like Solomon, like Jesus, be faithful. Be faithful to do all that I can to fulfill these tasks faithfully. Seek from God all that I may need to accomplish the tasks that God has given me. And that, I believe, is why the speech pleased the Lord. That's why God was so happy to hear that Solomon was not concerned with his own long life, was not concerned with his own riches, was not concerned that he have a name, was not concerned with himself, but he was concerned with what God had called him to. He was concerned with being a faithful king, to do his best and to seek God that he could be the best in whatever God has called him. May God bless us to have that same attitude, to have that same seeking of what can I do? What do I need from you, God, to be the best at everything you have called me to be?